Intermittent fasting can help you with metabolic flexibility, offer you sleeping pills. They're going to give you antidepressants, anti-anxiety agents. If you really think it down on a cellular level, like what is going on as women are navigating this time period in their lives, these changes in their bodies, that they start to spend more time reflecting on what they want.
Today, we have a very special guest, Cynthia Thurlow. Cynthia is a nurse practitioner with over 20 years of clinical experience in both emergency and cardiac medicine. She is the CEO and founder of the Everyday Wellness podcast. Cynthia is one of the leading functional nutritionists and intermittent fasting experts, a two-time TEDx speaker, and Cynthia just happens to be a best-selling author of the book, Intermittent Fasting Transformation, a 45-day program for women to lose stubborn weight, improve hormonal health, and slow aging. She is passionate about helping women find wellness through nutrition and fasting. Cynthia, it is such an honor. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I really have been looking forward to this conversation.
I have been looking so forward to this conversation. I am thrilled to have you on the show today. You are a wealth of knowledge, and I definitely appreciate a conversation with a like-minded fellow nurse practitioner. Cynthia, I know you have a story. I read a little bit about you, of course, but I would love for you to share a little bit about your journey, the journey leading up to you becoming a best-selling author.
Well, thank you for that warm introduction. I started as an ER nurse in inner city Baltimore, and like every good adrenaline-fueled junkie healthcare practitioner, I kind of was a natural progression into cardiology. And so I practiced both inpatient and clinical management of cardiology for over 16 years. And probably about 10 years in, I got increasingly disillusioned with our current medical model. I started to recognize the power of lifestyle. I was really passionate about talking to patients about food as medicine. And as you can imagine, that doesn't sit all that nicely with that traditional allopathic model that is all evidence-based, and you're prescribing 10, 15, 20 medications for every patient. And so in 2016, I took a leap of faith and I left clinical medicine without a business plan and became an entrepreneur, and later a fully autonomous nurse practitioner in the great state of Virginia. And along the way, life imitates art. I had been so focused on acute care, critical care medicine. And I think for a lot of us, even though we train at big research institutions, we think we know a lot about the aging process and certainly the changes that occur in women's bodies as they're getting older. But I always tell people, if I didn't know what to expect, how can I expect my patients to know what to expect? And so I hit the wall. Prior to leaving clinical medicine, I was the person that was up at 4 o'clock in the morning to go very hard conditioning workouts at the gym, go to the hospital, work all day. I had 2 young boys at the time. My husband did a lot of international travel, so I was solo parenting. I probably wasn't getting enough sleep, and I was probably not being conscientious about my macro intake, meaning I was probably too low carb, bordering on ketogenic diet, which for me, being at the stage of life I was in, didn't really work all that well. And so I say that I hit the wall. Everything that you're not supposed to do, I was doing, the over exercising, the not getting enough sleep, not being attuned to those macros. And so I hit this wall, and conventional medicine was offering me synthetic hormones and IUDs or procedures like an ablation or hysterectomy. And I was not interested in any of the above. And so I started working with a functional medicine provider, and that really opened up my eyes to the possibility of really looking at root cause medicine. And so working with her allowed me to kind of get my health back, but it also meant I had to change everything I was already doing. I always ate healthy. That wasn't the issue, but the over exercising, not prioritizing sleep, not prioritizing being in the parasympathetic where you're kind of in this rest and repose, relaxed state, really changed everything for me. And so I think in finding my health and kind of coming back to a state of awareness about how our body perceives stress as we're getting older, knowing that we're a little less stress resilient in perimenopause, and then also figuring out for me the strategies that were going to help me feel good. And ultimately, it ended up me creating a whole practice that was really attuned to the needs of women. And so I started attracting exactly the types of patients that I was, middle-aged women who felt very underserved, who felt very invisible in the medical system because they weren't really looking for contraception. They weren't dealing with, pregnancy or the postpartum period. There are women who probably weren't yet ready to talk about HRT, but didn't fully understand or appreciate the changes that were occurring in their bodies. And so little by little, I was creating group programs and one-on-one programs. And in 2018, I decided to challenge myself and do a TED Talk. And so I did one in 2018, one in 2019. Right in between, I started a podcast, which, in 2019, everything changed for me. It just really validated that the message of strategies that were sustainable long-term and not these gimmicky, crappy, quick fixes of lose 10 pounds in a week, really reaffirmed for me that lifestyle medicine is where things are at. And so I humbly sit back now and, I've done some really cool things over the past, 7 years. But I'm grateful for the journey because I think this is the work that I was meant to do. I am grateful for the thousands and thousands of patients I took care of in a more traditional environment. But the work I'm doing now is impacting more lives. And, quite frankly, a lot of nurses and nurse practitioners reach out almost every day saying, I want to do what you do. And so for me, I get to serve as a role model in many ways of the fact that nurses really are capable of doing amazing things.
I absolutely love that. All of the experiences that I went through in conventional medicine and then eventually moving more towards functional medicine, I don't regret anything that I've experienced and went through, because it is important to really have a good perspective for what the everyday person goes through. Of course, I read your book. I have the Audible and the Kindle version. So that says a lot about what I think of you as a writer.
Thank you. No, I was going to say, if you had asked me 20 years ago, would I be a published author? I would have said no. I think because I was so burned out when I finished my graduate program. And of course, at that time, they were pushing all of us to do our PhDs. And I was like, you don't understand, I don't want to write another word. We had to do a thesis for undergrad. Ironically enough, my thesis was in uterine cancer and endometrial cancer. So talk about, life coming full circle. But thank you for that. I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to write a book. It's a really incredible journey, honestly.
That is in my future at some point in time. It's something I've always wanted to do. I love how easy the book is, but it's also it's easy to read, but it's also very informative. How you don't have to be a health expert to understand the concepts that you've outlined. But at the same time, if you are in healthcare, there is ample information for all educational backgrounds. I want to get into some of the key concepts, but I have to say one of my favorite highlights of the book is how you get into the necessity to address your hormones and not just look at weight loss, dietary restrictions, or the latest Instagram trend to get a beach body. This is crucial to understand as hormones impact every aspect of our bodies, our minds. Can you speak a little bit about what you mean by hormones? Because there are quite a few that we have, and the why behind the need to factor them in prior to embarking on a weight loss journey.
Yeah, thank you for that. Hormones are essentially chemical messengers in the body. And I like to remind people that if we think about our brains, we have the hypothalamus pituitary axis. And so helping people understand that it's kind of like the command center of the body. It's constantly providing input to receptor sites and hormones. And I think that so many of us just really think about the hormone hierarchy in the sense that, well, I've heard of cortisol and I've heard of insulin and probably haven't heard of oxytocin, but it's very important. I think most of us have heard about our sex hormones, but it seems kind of arbitrary. We don't really know what happens day to day. And then beyond that, like accessory hormones. Obviously, I don't think of thyroid as an accessory hormone, but probably one that's underappreciated until women are actually struggling with probably weight loss resistance or fatigue or constipation or the myriad of symptoms that go along with that. And then thinking about hunger and satiety hormones like leptin and ghrelin. I mean, there are a lot of them. There are a lot beyond that. But those are the ones that usually at least give people a picture of the fact that they're all interrelated. that it's not as if one is playing a solo. It is this orchestration of these chemical messengers that allows us to sleep and allows us to have sex and allows us to feel good in our skin and allows us to run and allows us to get up and speak on stage or, provide a presentation. And so I think, like most individuals, we don't think about our hormones until we don't feel good. And then all of a sudden we start trying to work backwards. And for both of us that have these traditional allopathic backgrounds, but also we're also functionally trained, it's with the understanding that, it's not as if the endocrine system is, off on its own reservation and it doesn't interact with these other body systems. They're all interrelated. And so something as simple as stress. So we become less stress resilient as we are navigating the 10 to 15 years preceding menopause. So perimenopause, understanding that as our ovaries are producing less progesterone, we might have sleep disturbances, we might have more anxiety and depression. And traditional allopathic medicine is going to offer you sleeping pills. They're going to give you antidepressants, anti-anxiety agents, instead of saying, we know that your ovaries are producing less progesterone. We know your adrenal glands are helping to kind of step in as a backup quarterback. But what we really need is to maybe take 5 to 7 days of progesterone prior to your menstrual cycle starting. And that can be life-changing and also life-affirming. And I was listening to a podcast this morning with Peter Attia and a female endocrinologist. And what I love about Peter Attia, if your listeners aren't familiar with his work, is that he really takes a big stand on the lack of HRT for women. As an example, certainly my mother's generation, my aunts, he was mentioning his mother-in-law, he said, anyone in the past 20 to 25 years that wasn't put on HRT or was taken off after the Women's Health Initiative study has suffered needlessly. And and he said physicians, he wasn't speaking to everyone else, but I will then step in and say nurse practitioners, PAs, et cetera, nurse midwives, for all of us that weren't following the research and weren't clinically looking at the research that was done, shame on us, because we have had women needlessly suffer. And so I think that it really comes into helping our patients understand the fact that what we were trained in. I finished my nurse practitioner program in 2000, 2001 timeframe. Things have changed a lot since then. And if you're not staying current, then you are missing opportunities with your patients. And I think that's tragic. And so I just wanted to reaffirm that for each one of us navigating these changes in our bodies, we have to be our own best advocates. And I've gotten to the point now where I almost every single day am giving out IFM's website to say, go search for a provider near, or NAMS, North American Menopause Society, for women who are looking for HRT support, because it's getting to a point of ridiculousness. I will give you an example. Before I got on our recording, one of my patients, we work distantly, but she has a local person that facilitates her labs and does her pelvic exams and all those things. And we were having a conversation. I said, I really think you should talk to Dr. So-and-so about some HRT at bare minimum. How about some progesterone so you can sleep? She's more than 5 years into menopause. And her doctor said, the progesterone will increase the likelihood you will develop breast cancer.
Oh my
God. And my head almost blew off. I was like, that's not even factual.
No.
So physiologically, I don't even know how that would be manifested. But the point of why I'm sharing this is that we have to empower our patients to be their own best advocates and to find providers that can provide you with the support that you desire. And it could be that maybe you have a regular GYN and you go to someone else to get the hormones that you need for your body, whether it's thyroid replacement, whether it's progesterone, whether it's, estradiol patches or creams or compounded options. I think that we have to start encouraging our patients to advocate for themselves, because there's not enough voices out there saying, you don't have to not sleep and have no libido and just feel less than because your hormones have, and, with time, they will all, estrogen kind of drops off a cliff and progesterone's a slow withdrawal, same thing with testosterone, but about 25% of women, even in menopause, make enough testosterone. I don't know many of them, but these magical unicorns do exist. But helping to advocate for yourself so that you can spend the next 40% of your lifetime with a high quality of life, as opposed to feeling poorly. I think that we have conditioned women to believe that weight gain is a normal function of aging, and we should accept that. And that is one of those limiting beliefs that for me, it's particularly bothersome because it really doesn't have to be that way, is the point I'm trying to make.
You're absolutely right. I love that you brought this up. I love that you brought up we have to not just be focusing on what we did 20 or 30 years ago. What we were doing then isn't what the latest evidence-based information says is a better option. And we also need to individualize it to the human that's in front of us that's asking for some type of assistance. I definitely don't believe in just a broad approach, like a blanket approach, like everybody gets the same. And I talk to my patients about hormones all the time, especially one of the things I specialize in is the perimenopause phase. I'm one of us in the perimenopause phase, and that we have to consider, like you said, progesterone and how are we sleeping. I have yet to meet anyone in perimenopause who's just sailing right on through, doing great. And there's a lot of lifestyle factors, of course, and modifications that we can make to the foods we eat, the way we eat, which of course I'm very excited to get into. But we may require something additional like progesterone. So again, great point that you brought up. So I am very excited to get into the intermittent fasting conversation, as I'm sure my listeners are. There's something so magical about intermittent fasting. I'll share just a real quick story. My husband was diagnosed with prediabetes and high blood pressure at the beginning of last year and was told he needed to start medication, to which he opted not to choose this route and instead decided to embark on an extreme change to his lifestyle. And he did make some pretty dramatic changes. So aside from cutting out processed foods, sugars, refined carbohydrates, we talked about other strategies as his fasting insulin was also not optimal. So he dove headfirst into intermittent fasting and utilized the 16-8 time restricted window. And he's lost 63 pounds in the past year. He's no longer pre-diabetic. His blood pressure is optimal, as is his fasting insulin. And because of his experience, this guy who's lived his life in the construction business is now in school for nutrition.
That's amazing.
Which is it's like mind blowing to me, because he could not believe that the needle can be moved so drastically just by what you put in your body and when you put it in your body. So in my practice, I've worked with many women on lifestyle, mindset, sleep, and nutrition modifications. There are some major differences and things to consider with regards to intermittent fasting and gender. Men are much simpler hormonally. Can you speak a little bit about the nuances of intermittent fasting, particularly with regards to gender?
Yeah. So congratulations to your husband. I love hearing stories like that. And it really speaks to the fact that most chronic disease states that we see here in the United States are really mitigated by insulin resistance.
Yes.
When I look at women and men, I would say men and menopausal women who've gone more than 12 months without a menstrual cycle are kind of in a special spot. I think for most menopausal women and men, there's a lot less hormonal fluctuation day to day, week to week. So in many instances, I think it's sometimes easiest when you're no longer getting a cycle. I do think about women in three different buckets, though. Women that are at their peak fertile years, so 35 and under, are in one bucket. Then we have perimenopause, 10 to 15 years preceding menopause, then menopause. The caveats are as follows. Thin women that are at peak fertile years should not be fasting every single day. Could they do 12 hours of digestive rest? Absolutely. But if they're training for a race, or they are an athlete, and that's a small percentage of people, but if you're at that elite level, you shouldn't be fasting at all. Now, if you have PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, you're dealing with infertility, you're insulin resistant, and you're younger, you can absolutely benefit from a degree of intermittent fasting. And we could even argue that probably some longer fasts might be helpful for fat oxidation, but always with the caveat that there are times in your menstrual cycle to fast, and there are times when you should not fast. And so helping women understand what's going on in the follicular phase when estrogen predominates versus the luteal phase when progesterone predominates, how our exercise, our fasting regimens, et cetera, all change. And then perimenopause and menopausal women, lifestyle is critically important. It's important how your sleep quality is, how you manage your stress. Remember, I've already said women at this stage of life are less stress resilient.
Yes.
You add an anti-inflammatory nutrition. I don't care who you are. If you think you can party and eat like you did in college, you are in for a rude awakening in perimenopause, because you will slide into, I talked about those limiting beliefs that kind of really manifest for many women in middle age. You will be right there. And then also the piece is the right types of exercise. Gone are the days of chronic cardio. You really need to lift weights, lift heavy weights, and do zone 2 cardio, and probably some yoga or Pilates for flexibility work. And that's really what you need to be doing. But when we talk about perimenopause, menopause, the lifestyle piece becomes very important in order to have good success, because fasting is a form of hormesis, beneficial stress in the right amount at the right time. I see a lot of women with good intentions that are over fasting, they're over restricting their food, they're doing OMAD, 30 days out of the month, trying to explain to them that, we talk about this role of hormesis, just because a little bit of hormesis is good doesn't mean more is better. And so helping them understand how to navigate when in their cycle to fast. That means, when you have the follicular phase, when estrogen predominates, which is like your superpower, you're more insulin sensitive, you can push your workouts, you can go lower carbohydrate, versus not fasting the week before your menstrual cycle. And so helping women navigate a time, I would probably say 60% of my female clients and patients have fairly predictable cycles in perimenopause until like the tail end. And then as they're getting closer to menopause, and we can look at some labs like an FSH, it'll give us a sense. If your FSH is 70, guess what? You're like very close to menopause. Or if your FSH is 10, very likely that you've got a bit more reserve in the tank, if you will. And then once women are menopausal, 12 months without a menstrual cycle, again, focusing on those lifestyle pieces, I think it becomes much, much easier, because they don't have to worry about where they are in their cycle. It effectively, you have this much more greater balance of hormones. And I think for women that are taking HRT as an example, and I would say I probably have an equal mix of women on HRT and those that are not. The ones on HRT sleep better. They have, they can have more sexual intercourse without pain. They have a little bit more energy. And there's a lot of evidence to show that having a degree of estrogen on board can be very beneficial for multiple reasons. But, one of those in particular can be this loss of muscle mass as we're getting older. Sarcopenia is a real thing. It's not a question of if, but when. Helping people understand that your body in menopause, by virtue of having low estrogen, if you're not on HRT, and high FSH, follicular stimulating hormone, your protein needs actually increase. And if you're not meeting those needs, then your body is going to seek out calories, probably from the stuff you don't want to be eating, the fat, the carbs, I should say the processed fat and carbs, not like you're going to overdo it on an apple. But I think for people to kind of understand that physiologically, even at that stage of life, you have to be mindful of those macros, making sure you're getting your protein macros in, because your protein needs actually increase at that stage of life. I always say, like, I have teenagers, and I'm gone through the reverse puberty, and I say actually, like, our protein needs in my mind are equally important. They're in a massive anabolic phase, and I want to avoid the catabolism that can go on with muscles and metabolic health as we're getting older.
Yeah, that is so true. I know for myself, coming into the perimenopause phase, I made dramatic changes because what I was doing was not working anymore. And that's what I hear often in my practice is I was doing X, Y, and Z and it was fine. And now nothing's working. And when I ask, what are you eating? There's such a small amount of protein, and strength training is not usually really a big part of their exercise program. For myself, when I made that dramatic change from running every day, not only was I running physically, but running myself into the ground, not sleeping, eating really poorly, like not eating enough, I started to notice really severe downstream effects, everything from like worse headaches to cramps to moodiness to anxiety, severe anxiety, actually. And it wasn't until I started doing less, where now I find one of my favorite things to do is just walk. I do my strength training 3 times a week. I still do HIIT training, but I'm not doing intense training to stress my body every single day. So yes, absolutely. I find having the conversation where we actually need to slow down, do a little bit less, can be a really eye-opening situation once we realize, hey, this actually is true. Our conditioning where no, just restrict calories, no, just do more, just do more is really not going to be as effective with this time of hormonal fluctuations.
Well, and I think that's hard for a lot of women. They are so conditioned to be sympathetic driven.
Yes.
And to the concept of relaxing, like my mom is retired. She had a very, very, very big job before she retired. And she's 5 years into retirement. And maybe just now she's starting to relax a little bit. And I always say, my husband and I just kind of, we're introverted. We kind of build in relaxation into our weekends. It's like a buffer zone. And I say all the time, like even we relocated during the pandemic to a different part of our state. And for me, the quality of life metrics are so important.
Yes.
So important. So, you mentioned the walking. We walk with our dogs every day. We're out in nature. We're getting that sunlight exposure. We're reminding our bodies, suppress melatonin, get cortisol going. It's the start of the day. And yet it's funny how many people like just don't even realize they're in the rat race.
Yes.
Until something happens and then they have to change everything. But I do think that women are so focused on helping everyone else that they feel selfish or they feel guilty about prioritizing themselves. And that's a really, especially now that I have teenagers, I've got one who's going to be, I have a rising senior, a rising sophomore. And so we're looking at colleges and having those conversations. And, one is driving, one will soon be driving. And you start to realize, like, if I hadn't spent the last nearly 18 years like having something that I'm investing in while my kids are at school, it would be a whole lot harder to recognize that, my relationship with my kids is changing because they're getting more independent, but I mean, I'm still there for them. But I think for a lot of women, they put so much of themselves into their children, their spouse, their family, their loved ones, that they just forget about themselves. And so my hope is that as women are navigating this time period in their lives, these changes in their bodies, that they start to spend more time reflecting on what they want and what they want to advocate for. And there's a great book by Olivia Weaver called Rushing Woman Syndrome. And so I oftentimes will recommend that to patients because I think it's a problem for most, if not all of women, that they're just doing too much. Like their brains never shut off. Their to-do list is going all the time.
Yes.
And it's just exhausting, right?
Yes.
They're just exhausted.
It is exhausting. And that is, you probably described like at least 80% of my awesome female population of patients just overdoing it. And when I say, you're the most important person in your life, they're like, I am? Yes, you are.
They need that permission because they've been conditioned to believe that as a woman that you subjugate your needs and you prioritize everyone else. And I always use the analogy of, if you're on a flight and they tell you got to put your face mask on, God forbid, you need the oxygen mask come down, you got to put them on yourself before you give them to your kids. And I think that's a really good way of identifying you have to fill your bucket, much like as I transitioned from traditional allopathic medicine, where I was used to being in the hospital at 7:30 in the morning and rounding, and I oftentimes didn't get to eat, let alone pee. I was chronically dehydrated and I didn't even realize it. And now I have my schedule built in. Like when I get up in the morning, the first things I work on is like, some type of professional reading, mindset work. I get my exercise in, I lay on my PMF mat, and I tell my team, like, I don't start work until X time. I just don't, because I need to do all those things so I can show up for, podcast interviews and my own podcast, other things I do in my business, my clients, my patients. And I think that's so contrary to what we've been conditioned to believe. And certainly as nurses, nurses, we're supposed to, we're supposed to be codependent and, we're supposed to be, subservient to everyone, to our own needs in order to take care of everybody else. And so I think that reframe is very important and certainly very empowering.
It absolutely is. And that reference with the plane and the oxygen mask, that was me. And actually I used to say, no, I wouldn't put it on myself first because I'm really tough. It's like, no, that's actually not very intelligent, and that we have to take care of ourselves. And now it is a part of my everyday self-care. And I really want to help empower other women, or all individuals, that they need the time to reflect, to do things that make them feel good in their bodies, their minds, take care of themselves. Because how can we give our best to the world, to everybody else, if we're not giving the best we have to ourselves?
Yeah. And they always say that you can't fill from an empty cup. And I think
Yes.
that people just forget. And it's interesting because I always worked part-time as an NP when my kids were younger. And obviously being an entrepreneur is like, if I wanted it to be a 24/7, but
Yeah.
I have firm boundaries about when I stop working, and trying to explain to my team, yes, I know this program should be done by now, but I'm not going to not go to bed on time, because sleep is important, especially at this stage of life. And trying to explain to many of my team members who are in their 30s, so different life stage, which is totally fine. But I remember when I was in my 20s and 30s, like I didn't need to sleep as much. Like now I genuinely need to sleep a solid 7, 8 hours a night of sleep. I could have gotten by. And I'm sure you remember like nursing school, and when you're in your NP program, I mean,
Yeah.
you're just 24/7, just exhausting pace of like working and being a student and being in class and doing clinicals. And we were trying to explain to my husband, I'm like, I'm glad you didn't know me then, because I was always working, because I always had to get my hours in. And it would be like 7 p to 11 p on a Friday night. Like there was no social life. I was
Yeah.
getting 4 hours of work in because I was contracted to work so many hours a week. But yeah, I think that for nearly every woman, they have to kind of reallocate where their priorities are. And it's hard to say no. It's hard to put those boundaries up and say, I don't want to disappoint you, but that's not realistic.
You're right. Once you start doing it, though, it's a lot easier for me to say no, or for me to think, do I really want to do that? I don't think so, because then I'm going to be home late. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
going to sleep as well. I'm very in tune with my sleep wake cycle, and it's like a, what is the word I'm looking for? It's sacred. This
Mm-hmm.
time is sacred. My husband knows. He's like, it's getting late. Get away from your desk. Put your computer down. And sometimes I could use a little gentle reminder. It could be really easy to get wrapped up into things, but we definitely need to remember to prioritize ourselves, and really make it like a non-negotiable, like you said,
Mm-hmm.
where you're going to just say, no, my day isn't starting until this time. And even if that means not going to some social events because it's not going to be conducive for your health, for your well-being, for where you're at right now, we definitely need to pay attention to those things. You spoke a little bit about your mom with the sympathetic nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
Another part of your book that I highlighted and love is when you were talking about the parasympathetic nervous system and the role it plays in our digestion.
Mm-hmm.
I would love for you to elaborate a little more on that.
Yeah. So we have the autonomic nervous system, and there's two main branches. There's sympathetic, like you're being chased by a rabid animal. And this is what allows you to have your muscles fueled, and you can run and you can focus. You're not going to stop and digest your food, have sex or an orgasm. You're really focused on like fleeing danger. And then you have the sympathetic, which is kind of the opposite of that. It's when you can detoxify. It's when you can be relaxed. You can connect with others. I mean, it's important for us to have balance, but unfortunately now in our kind of harried, overstimulated existence, we tend to be in this fight or flight mode more so than the rest in repose of parasympathetic. And so I like to remind people that digestion starts in our brains. People, if I ask kids or even adults, I say, where's digestion start? And they always say my mouth, my stomach. And I have to remind them it really starts in our brain. So we have to be in the right frame of mind. This is why eating on the go, eating in your car, eating when you're standing up, et cetera, is
Yes.
not good for you. And so I'll give you an example. So in those years of working in hospitals, like if I got to eat, it was always with a pager. I had a hospital phone.
Mm-hmm.
I was lucky if I didn't get interrupted 15 times. There was no parasympathetic digestion at all going on. Whereas now I built into my schedule time for me to sit down and eat. And I usually like sit at my kitchen island and just kind of relax. It's so nice. But what happens in our bodies when we're in this kind of relaxed parasympathetic state, we break down and emulsify fats better. we are in a position where we can be properly accepting of food. There's enough hydrochloric acid being secreted in the stomach. Our food kind of moves from our stomach into our small intestine, and then ultimately into our large intestine, and understanding that our liver is designed to break down and detoxify not just things we're exposed to in terms of medications, but things in our environment. It's not optimized if we're constantly chronically stressed. And I think most people think of detoxification as being like this cool catch-all phrase of potions and pills and powders. And I have to remind them, like, our body detoxifies just by breathing, sweating, pooping, urinating, all these things. And when our digestion is optimized, there's a really cool kind of, I don't want to use the term syndrome, that's incorrect, but there's this really cool mechanism that goes on in the gut. It's called the migrating motor complex, or the MMC, and it's like a street sweeper, but it literally needs 4 to 5 hours in between our meals to properly move things along rhythmically, getting rid of things that don't belong, pushing things forward in the gut. But most people are eating too frequently. They're eating, hyper palatable, highly processed food-like substances, and our bodies never get a break. We never get the MMC to kick in to help move things along. And when you think about the standard American diet, it is a low residue diet. Well, what does that mean? That means there's very little that needs, fiber. There's very little true food substances in a McDonald's hamburger and French fries that are cooked in seed oils and a soda, versus having a steak or chicken with a salad at your home. And so helping people understand that this meal frequency piece, added in with being sympathetic dominant most of the time, contributes to why we have so many digestive issues. I just interviewed Dr. Robin Chutkin, who's this acclaimed gastroenterologist, and she was talking about the role of fiber in the diet, and how, most Americans are getting like 5 grams of fiber a day when it should be more like 40. And I think fiber is very bio-individual. Like, some people can tolerate more, others don't, probably because they have some degree of SIBO or SIFO going on. But just helping people understand that the nutrient density of our foods is super important, along with that meal frequency, along with giving ourselves some digestive rest. That's why even if you don't intermittent fast, which I know both of us are huge proponents of, 12 hours of digestive rest should be the bare minimum for every adult. Like, you don't eat between dinner and breakfast, which blows most people's minds, because they eat a lot of their food like substances from, desserts after dinner, and alcohol and beer and whatever else people are engaging in. So
mindless eating.
Yeah, exactly. So I think from a lot of different perspectives, understanding that our body's constantly searching for balance, but when it comes to meals and it comes to digestive optimization, you really have to work diligently at doing the opposite of what most people are doing. Like I always say, it's almost like years ago, my kids had these like Superman books, and the Superman, it was like the opposite of good Superman was like bad Superman in this alternative universe. And so I always say it's like the upside down, because everything is completely the opposite of what it should be, but that has become our norm, unfortunately.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I wanted to touch on the thyroid also. I'm very passionate about thyroid health. My functional medicine journey was fueled by the loss of my thyroid. We know that the thyroid is a major player in metabolism. Unfortunately, we have been trained throughout our lives to believe that to keep our metabolism up, we need to eat constantly, 6 times a day, constant snacking every 2 hours. I used to eat 6 times a day, and I was constantly symptomatic with hypoglycemia, fueling the fire with more sugar and refined carbohydrates. Now I ditched the junk food, processed foods, and sugar. I eat 2 meals a day. Typically, I follow a 14-10, but at least a 12-12. And my blood sugar is more stable than it's ever been. I want to tease out how intermittent fasting can be beneficial for thyroid issues, metabolism, blood sugar. Let's start with the thyroid. Is intermittent fasting even possible for those concerned about thyroid health?
Absolutely. And for full transparency, I'll share that I have very stable Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And so if you really think it down on a cellular level, like what is going on at a cellular level at the mitochondria, which are effectively the powerhouses of our cells, helping to generate ATP, which is this energy molecule. Intermittent fasting can help you with metabolic flexibility. Now, let me back up and explain what that is. So metabolic flexibility means our bodies can effectively use glucose, stored glycogen, fats, ketones for energy. That is how it is optimally used. However, most individuals, including many people that have thyroid health issues, have a lack of metabolic flexibility because they eat too frequently. They eat the wrong types of foods. Most individuals eat too little protein, adulterated seed oils, and too many processed carbohydrates, which contributes to the lack of metabolic flexibility. We are not designed to be eating 200 to 300 grams of carbohydrates a day. We don't need carbohydrates to thrive.
No.
And that is a very unpopular opinion. We need protein, we need healthy fats. That is without question. We could debate whether or not carbohydrates are necessary. We like carbohydrates, we don't need carbohydrates. And so when I'm talking to people about thyroid health, I'm helping them understand that if we are getting to a point where our body, and I always use the car analogy, which drives everyone crazy, but my dad is the kind of person that drives enough miles to be at a quarter tank or 3/4 of a tank of gas, and he has to top it off. That's kind of his mentality. And so if you are eating every 2 to 3 hours or more frequently than that, you are topping off that gas tank. You are never allowing your body to go in and utilize stored fat as a fuel source. If you can't use stored fat, you are going to struggle to go more than 2 to 3 hours without meals. You are going to be weight loss resistant. You are going to have issues with blood sugar instability. You probably will get hangry. You'll have slumps after meals. We want you to be the opposite. We want you to be able to go 4 to 5 hours between meals. Ideally be, weight loss sensitive, meaning if you're trying to lose weight, that actually works effectively and that you have sustained energy. And that is the way we are optimized. Now, there's always a lot of questions. Can you effectively intermittent fast if you have thyroid health issues? Yes, if your thyroid is stable. Like if you have you have a hot thyroid, you've got Hashimoto's, you have Graves', your medication isn't stable, you're very symptomatic, that is probably not the time to add gasoline to a fire. I would probably wait until you're on a solid medication, you feel good, you're sleeping well, you have plenty of energy, then you add in some fasting. Do I think that nearly every person listening benefits from 12 hours of digestive rest? Absolutely. Do I think that stable thyroid patients that need some mitochondrial bump, need a little bit of mitochondrial support, can they benefit from fasting? Absolutely. And so I think that there are many factors that influence what's going on with our thyroid. I mean, it can be thyroid cofactors. It can be things that you're exposed to in your environment, like pollutants or mold or mycotoxins. There's a lot of different tick-borne illnesses for that matter. So many things that show up as thyroid issues that are really just the canary in the coal mine. There's a whole lot more that's going on. And so I fervently believe, and I think all of the thyroid experts I've had on the podcast, with the exception of one, are huge proponents of fasting. But again, it's that hormetic stressor. So right amount, right time, not over fasting, because again, it's that kind of propensity of our mindset of a little bit is good, more is better. And I generally will say to women, there's probably a happy medium. And I just think for a lot of women that are leaner or thin, irrespective of age, less fasting is probably more. Like the doing OMAD and doing 36-hour fasts and 72-hour fasts like every week. Unless you are metabolically really unhealthy and need that to kind of, break through some plateaus, I think in most other instances, people definitely benefit.
Yeah. And we definitely need balance. Like you said, we don't need to be doing, if something's working, like my husband, for example, it was very successful. He changes it up. He always goes at least 12, but sometimes he'll do 14. He's went 24 hours. He doesn't keep it the same. He listens more to like the cues from his body, how he feels and what he's doing. So the days, because he is still in construction, even though he's in school.
Yeah.
And so the days that he's working, 14-hour days, that's probably a day that he needs to eat.
Yes.
But high quality foods.
Yes.
Because I forget who, somebody had said to me before, what's the difference between eating like a McDonald's cheeseburger and then just eating meat that you make at home? It's still beef. I'm like, there's a huge difference. There's a huge difference. Aside from the fact that what's the quality of the meat, how crazy processed that it is. You know, there's chemicals that are inside of those fast foods. I don't want any part of those chemicals. And those kinds of foods were a large part of my husband's diet, not anymore. And a lot of women that I've worked with, not really seeing like, well, what's the big deal if I just grab what are they called? I'm not very familiar with McDonald's, like an egg McMuffin, like whatever the breakfast would be. Like, what's the big deal if I just have that, versus if I just make some eggs at home. Yeah. So it definitely, I think there's a huge education piece of it. You mentioned seed oils. This is a topic I get really fired up about, that we need to read labels. We need to read labels to see every ingredient that's in there, labels for what we put in our body, what we put on our body, products in our home, because we're getting an overwhelming amount of chemicals. And once you start having like endocrine issues, I know for myself, when everything kind of went spiraling out of control, I became ultra sensitive to lots of things, fragrances. I had to get rid of every candle. Of course, I don't use dryer sheets. And it's definitely a passion of mine to educate, because I've seen huge changes in a person, like for their health, just by working on that for a while, because of the huge impact that it can make with our health.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think, one of the things that I generally say is good, better, best. So if someone is traveling and their option is to have a naked McDonald's burger, that's going to be better than, going and having a Slurpee. That's going to be better than, grabbing a laced, thing of like McDonald's French fries. But you're right. I think the average consumer assumes whatever's in the grocery store is healthy. They assume whatever's in a restaurant is healthy. We rarely eat out. I have teenagers that love Chipotle on Friday nights. And so I'm glad that Chipotle is moving towards no longer using seed oils. But I think for a lot of individuals, they just don't, it's a lack of understanding or a significant degree of cognitive dissonance. Like they're just not ready for the message. But we have to just keep educating people so that they understand, so they think thoughtfully about, what they're bringing into their home, what they're applying to their bodies. I always say, if you think about it, we used to say that our skin was our largest organ. Now I know it's muscles, but understanding that, if you go to like the average drugstore and buy an average body lotion, it's full of crap. And it's so sad because, I used to be that person that used Dove soap and I used Dove deodorant, antiperspirant deodorant. And then as I got educated, I was like, well, we're meant to sweat. Why do I want to be on an antiperspirant? And why do I want to be on a product that has 95 ingredients in it when it should just be soap? Like it should be a vehicle for the soap to work, and it should just work. And now it's, Dr. Bronner's. But I think for a lot of people, they just don't know. And it can be woefully overwhelming when they learn. So I always say, like, pick one thing, read every food label, because things change all the time. That's number one. Number two, ask questions. Find out how to, get the highest quality meat or fish or poultry that your budget permits. I know some people will say, it's more important to me that I get, wild caught fish than it is that I get pasture raised pork. But, it's finding out what works for everyone's budgets and constraints and, environmental working group, which fruits and vegetables, is it worth buying organic and save money on the ones you don't need to buy as organic? Here's the hint: anything that doesn't have the skin you can peel off, like berries, definitely worth it to buy organic, as painfully expensive as they are.
Yeah. There's nothing I want in my body to affect hormone signaling or impact my detoxification at all. And you're right. It can be a barrier because it could be so overwhelming. But the other side of that is you can't unknow this. Like once your eyes are open to it, it can be like, I don't go out to eat very much either. I'm gluten-free, dairy-free. I'm thinking I can react pretty easily to foods, and then I don't feel so well. So I'm very strategic. Like if I'm on a car trip, I've got everything I need in the car. Like I'm not relying on stopping anywhere or doing anything because I'm not going to feel great. I might be a little bit more rigid with things because I am so sensitive to changes that I make in my diet can really greatly impact me like pretty quickly. But once you know these things, it's like life changing. But
Mhm.
I feel like once you get past the overwhelming part, it's life changing in a great way,
Yeah.
because then you know, like, key factors for how you can protect your body, optimize your health. So those things are definitely like important to pay attention to.
Absolutely.
I want to talk about recipes. So I love cooking. It's one of my favorite things to do. Not everybody loves to cook, and easy to follow recipes can make the daunting task of cooking a lot more enjoyable. So your book has 50 recipes,
It
I believe.
does. It does. And I have to say, Beth Lipton is masterful and just an amazing friend and chef. And so we collaborated on those, but they're generally her ideas that she kind of shared with me. And I was like, yes, 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 yes. But yeah, I think half the battle is preparing to succeed when it comes to food prep.
And I think, having a plan, like, I love that, it's a plan, like, laid out for my patients. I have different, depending on what's going on with them, I have different structured meal plans. I'll personalize them, of course, also. But having an idea, like, so many women are like, just tell me what to eat. Like, what should I eat? And instead of me just writing it down, which I have done, because I always ask, well, what are you eating?
Mm-hmm.
And if they're eating just a piece of bread, maybe with a little bit of avocado on there, I'm like, well, where's your protein coming from? So, just the educational part of what to add in to make it more balanced and more filling. And I've got to say, I'm trying to think if anybody hadn't had this experience. I feel like every single woman that I've worked with this is like, there is so much food to eat. Like, I am full. And it's just from little tweaks, from adding in more protein is crucial for us to feel good. And of
Yeah.
course, healthy fats, which I
Yeah.
used to be afraid of. I'm definitely not afraid of anymore, because that's just the ridiculous food industry for years trying to get everybody to eat low fat.
Well, imagine being in cardiology. You should see some of the
Oh my God.
handouts we used to give to patients, low fat, non-fat, crap, seed oil spreads, and
Oh goodness.
no butter. Butter's bad, cream is bad, low fat, non-fat milk. I'm like, ugh, yuck.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Hmm.
Cynthia, this has been wonderful. You're a true inspiration, and I could easily see you and I hanging out, like, at, get grabbing lunch it would have to be strategically chosen, or coffee somewhere. And before I let you go, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you feel my listeners need to know? Like, clinical pearls you feel are crucial for optimal health?
Yeah, I would say little things that make a big difference. Taking a 5, 10, 15-minute walk after a meal is great for blood sugar regulation. And I used to make fun of the people in my neighborhood that were probably the age I am now, and my husband, that did that. And so now we walk after dinner. I mean, we have become those people. We just enjoy walking, but we do it with our dogs. And I'd say you don't need to have fancy equipment to help with metabolic flexibility. So take a 10, a 15-minute walk after your meal. And I think at a minimum, you should be kind of monitoring how much physical activity you have every day. So if you have an Oura ring, you have a Apple Watch, you have a Whoop band, you have some type of tracking device, aiming for at least 5,000 steps a day. I kind of work on 10 to 15,000, but I think all of us could, that they call it NEAT. So it's this kind of non-traditional physical activity that is so important. Walk farther, park your car farther out from the grocery store, get in those extra steps. I would say those two things are certainly helpful. Eating less often. It doesn't have to be that you technically intermittent fast. It could be 12 hours of digestive rest, can be hugely impactful. And I promise you, once you get to a point when you are no longer snacking and you are properly putting your meals together with 30 to 50 grams of protein, you're not going to be hungry in between your meals. And I think that's life changing. You mentioned you suffered from hypoglycemia and energy slumps and all these things. And I say all the time, like, sometimes I forget to eat. I mean, that doesn't happen often, but it's because I'm so metabolically healthy that my body knows I've got plenty of fat that it can go to. If it needs to pull out, it's kind of like taking a withdrawal from the bank. It knows exactly where to go for getting some energy. if I go a little bit longer in a fasted state. And then the last thing is really focusing on sleep. I think sleep is so undervalued and so underappreciated. And yet we know from research that if you're getting less than 6 hours of sleep a night, we know that there's a higher propensity of blood sugar dysregulation, higher insulin, higher cortisol, less balance between leptin and ghrelin, which are these appetite and satiety hormones. And that's not going to make you crave the good stuff. You're going to crave the junk. You're not going to crave chicken and broccoli. You're going to be going after the bag of chips, the ice cream, the cupcakes, the things that are not going to help with blood sugar stability, and certainly not with metabolic flexibility. So I would say those are three things that are kind of high level concepts that I think you don't necessarily have to buy something to do it. It's just, you own a pair of sneakers, you eat less often, you go to bed earlier.
I love that. That's definitely very insightful and necessary words for all of us to really think about and pay attention to. How can my listeners find you?
Thank you. So probably easiest to go to my website. So it's www.cynthiathurlow.com. There you can find my podcast, Everyday Wellness, where I get to interview the best and the brightest in the healthcare space. You can also get access to my book. And you can also see links to products that I have 2 supplements that I created out of many years of trying to figure out what works best. And then you can find me on Instagram. If you find me on Twitter, I'm a little bit snarky, be forewarned. And I have a free private Facebook group called Intermittent Fasting Lifestyle / my name that is for men and women. It's a drama-free zone, and we'd love to see you there.
I will link all of that up in the show notes. I'm never on Twitter, but now I'm fascinated.
It depends on my mood. Sometimes I get myself into trouble. Sometimes I purposely will get myself into some trouble, and it's all very benign. Like I don't ever say things that are directed to be hurtful, but every once in a while I have to kick a can, and
a little
I can
sass.
Sometimes, yeah, I grew up in New Jersey. It would be to be expected.
I grew up in Brooklyn.
Oh,
yeah, sass is fun. It makes life a little bit more enjoyable.
yes.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. This has been a true pleasure, and I will have to have you back on the show someday.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to.